The world is facing a climate crisis, the impact of which is already clear to see. But this is not a crisis that's being shared equally. It is a crisis of racial and social injustice. The impacts of pollution, worsening air quality, and rising sea levels have a greater impact on marginalized groups, without them having the same access to policy-making power to shape a changing world. I'm Nani Jansen Reventlow, the founder of Systemic Justice. We work to radically transform how the law works for communities fighting for racial, social, and economic justice. In this series, we'll look at 3 dimensions to the climate crisis: air quality, rising sea levels, and the cost of the green transition. And we'll see how communities are fighting for justice as the world comes to terms with a rapidly changing climate.
The wind turbines you see behind me are part of one of the largest wind farms in Europe.
They're also the reason why there aren't any reindeer roaming the area of Fosen anymore.
When it comes to tackling the climate crisis, some governments have recognized the scale of the issue. But solutions sometimes follow the same old patterns of exploitation and inequality.
In an unexpected ruling late last year, Norway's Supreme Court stated that the wind turbines was built on permits that are no longer valid. The reason is that the permits breaches the Sámi people's right to exercise its culture.
In northern Sweden and Norway, massive wind farms are being built as part of the move away from fossil fuels. But they have taken land from Sámi communities who've used it for centuries to herd their reindeer.
My name is Matti Blindberg. Today I'm the chairman of the Swedish Reindeer Herder Association.
Både svårt och lätt att svara på. The reindeer is a creature that's very dependent on the nature, which makes it that a part of our way of living is down to the fact that we live with reindeer and they're dependent on the climate and seasons and so on. And the culture has developed in accordance with the reindeer and the way that the reindeer has to live. And the reindeer is very dependent on the land that we live on. So naturally it becomes an almost existential question to be part of the reindeer's lives, but also our own lives.
Speciellt avgörande, det är ett absolut måste.
I'm Beskhan Elias and I'm a politician right now, member of the Sámi parliament on Norwegian side. Also, some people call me activist. I am an actor. Also, my education is Sámi handicrafts. The Sámi nation, we are a nation crossing four borders, we are in 4 different states: Russia, Finland, Sweden and Norway. And we inhabit our traditional territories and we inhabit the northernmost parts, like in Scandinavia and also the Kola Peninsula on Russian side. So that's our homeland. And we are estimated, there is no official register, but the estimated population of all between 50,000 and a couple of 100,000. Very few regarding the huge area we inhabit. Reindeer is in many ways like buffalo was and is for Native Americans and also First Nations in Canada. The culture is based around reindeer. So even though all of us are not reindeer herders, our culture, handicraft and storytelling very much is based around the reindeer from the time that reindeer was not semi-domesticated and owned. So it's a very important animal and it is adapted to our Arctic climate, our cold areas over thousands of years. But we see a huge change in that now. It's hard to adapt to the new reality that climate change has brought. The Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world. And we see the huge effects in especially the winter time, how climate change affects it gets plus degrees in the winter. And that's the problem. We get rain weather, and when rain freezes, it gets to ice. So the reindeer and other animals that are grazing, they can't reach to the food. So many reindeer herders now have to feed the reindeer, and it's not a natural way of doing things at all. And it's both labor intensive, it's not good for the reindeer, it's not economically sustainable. And now we get this so-called green transition on top of that is to solve this problem, to lose even more land. And many people don't know that wind turbines are a huge problem for us, because wind turbines, even though it's so-called sustainable and green technology, whenever one wind turbine is put up, the effects from it is that animals won't go near, and especially reindeer, in a 5-kilometer diameter. And now we got planned in Sámi areas and in reindeer grazing areas the biggest wind power projects in Europe today. It's a huge worry for us, and it would be devastating. We have already given land to both mining, to hydropower, and now we have to pay the price for climate change, even though we are not the ones who have contributed to climate change. It's the overconsumption in the world and the capitalism that has driven this madness that is going on. So it's when people are talking about just transition, then I can tell very clearly that this is not a just transition, that we have to give up our livelihoods, our culture, and our future, basically, to solve the capitalistic problem that the world has created for themselves.
I am Eva-Maria Fjellheim. I'm a Southern Sámi researcher from the Norwegian side of Sápmi, the Sámi homelands. I'm currently working as a researcher, finalizing a PhD on this issue of green colonialism in Sámi reindeer herding lands. So we had this case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It was one of Europe's largest onshore wind energy projects on the lands of the reindeer herding community of Fosenbjerke. And they, as a consequence, they lost one of their most important winter pastures. And again, we can see that these winter pastures are even more important for the future, just because of climate change making the winters more difficult. The reindeer herders won in the Supreme Court in 2021. And this verdict is special in many ways. First, because it is the first time that a Supreme Court verdict in Norway rules in favor of a Sámi reindeer herding community because an industrial project is violating their right to enjoy their culture through reindeer herding. The ruling was also very clear that there are no way of mitigating these negative impacts, and that coexistence between the wind energy infrastructure and Sámi reindeer herding culture it's incompatible. We had that Supreme Court verdict, which was a huge win. The reindeer herders demanded the government to follow up this verdict by regenerating and giving the lands back, meaning to deconstruct the whole infrastructure, as it would be the only kind of solution to absolve the human rights violation that the court had ruled. But what happened was that the government refused to repatriate the lands. Instead, they initiated new processes of impact assessments and looking for a way for these wind energy sites' production to continue. So this, of course, provoked massive protests, the biggest mobilizations we have seen in Sámi rights movements since the 1780s.
The Prime Minister said during the Fosen demonstrations in Oslo or after that, we have to make sure that this never happens again. But then it went a few months and then it happened again. Then they opened this Melkøya project. It's a gas project, and they are to electrify or make it electrical run, this gas plantation. And then they need power. They need huge amounts of power to make symbol politics out of reducing CO2 emissions. Because what this project does, it prolongs the production of gas that everyone knows is a CO2 emitter. It grabs land, it destroys land to make this symbol politics, just so the company can have production for 15, 20 years more.
The green transition is rushing further industrial expansion on Sámi reindeer herding lands. This expansion is justified by this green transition and like this moral obligation to make sacrifices. And then we have these settler colonial structures that remain through the legal and political system, even though the Sámi reindeer herders made use of the system, existing system, the legal system, and they won. But the government refused to respect the verdict and trying to find a way to wiggle around, to be able to still keep the wind energy projects running.
In the darkest moments, there is not much positivism on my account, but then we gathered, then I meet other people, and we still have our culture, and our culture is strong and it's rising. The last couple of decades, we have had a real rising in our culture. The new generations are taking back language. They are learning the handicraft again. They are doing all they can that our culture will thrive and survive. So even though it's very hard sometimes to see a bright future, then I believe in the work we are doing, that we will adapt and we will somehow manage to survive. But how things are going now, then it's very easy to get pessimistic on behalf of our culture.
I have to be optimistic about the future, otherwise I just close down the shop. So I have to be optimistic. But what I see happens both in Sweden and Norway, we have court cases that been in the highest court and give the Sámi people the right. But then the politicians and other strong stakeholders in both Sweden and Norway try to go around these court cases and find other ways. That scares me a little bit, because that put the democratic society in a very bad light.
That was Matti Blindberg, Eva Fjallgren, and Beska Niles. Marginalized communities are being forgotten, ignored, or even seen as holding back progress when it comes to solving problems they've had no part in creating. Magda Bulabiza is from the European Network Against Racism. I asked her if the experience of the Sámi was reflected in communities across Europe.
I'm Magda Bulabiza, and I'm a policy and advocacy advisor at the European Network Against Racism, the civil society organization that was created in 1998 and that aims at doing research and advocacy to dismantle structural racism in Europe. And as a network, we have over 150 members located all around Europe and working on different manifestations of racism like Afrophobia, anti-Semitism, but also more thematic approach around migration or digital rights or employment, for instance.
What do we mean when we speak about the just transition? And I'm particularly curious what this means for marginalized communities.
So we live in a world where the economy is centered around profit, around wealth generation. And this wealth generation is done through the extraction of resources like fossil fuels, for instance, or through the exploitation of people and of their labor. And the just transition is essentially a process and a practice that aims at shifting this economy towards a regenerative one. In a just transition, power is redistributed to local communities, funds are divested from oppressive and violent projects, and essentially no one is left behind. This means for marginalized communities that they do not bear the burden of mitigation and adaptation measures to the climate crisis, and where there is a deep democratic process that requires their meaningful participation in the solution.
What other groups are currently losing out in this process?
I would say all marginalized groups that face discrimination are losing out to the green transition. In our research, racialized minorities are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, despite contributing the least. First, they face racism in the climate crisis from having to live next to landfills or next to polluted spaces or by being denied a safe and healthy life. But in the transition itself and the measures that are taken to adapt and to mitigate the climate crisis, racism operates too. We see it, for instance, in how colorblind the measures taken are and the lack of consideration for racial justice issues. And a good example of that is the fact that environmental racism is not recognized in Europe as a manifestation of racism. And this absence of recognition is also a statement from political decision makers. It's a statement because this recognition would require to create reparation mechanisms to address the harm that was done.
So earlier in this episode, we heard about the Sámi community who are losing out from the development of wind farms, of the placement of wind turbines in the areas where they herd reindeer. Are you hearing similar stories to this one across Europe?
So there is this city in Romania called Cluj-Napoca that is currently being labeled as the Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe. And to make place for all of the projects that require this new label, essentially tourism, offices, businesses, and so on, the Roma communities that used to live there have been displaced to live in this landfill called Batarat. Romania is a country with high incineration rates for waste, meaning that the waste in these landfills get burned, and that these Roma communities have been forced to live in these conditions where the air they breathe is polluted by the waste that is getting burned. And in addition to that, the landfill is in a flood-prone area, meaning that whenever it rains, there are risks for people's lives from living in a flood-prone area. Essentially, this crisis and the solutions that are put forward, whether they are inclusive of racial justice or not, or of social justice more broadly, it comes down to political will to take the necessary measures and to act upon a just transition. And at the same time, this political will, or lack thereof, I should say, is heavily influenced by powerful lobbies, especially in the fossil fuel industry, that are blocking any progress from happening.
I'm still going to see if there's any glimmer of hope in all of this. Is there anything that gives you hope at the moment? Is there reason for optimism?
Whilst I do observe polarization of society and especially a rise of the far right, I also see that solidarity is growing and that people have started to mobilize and to organize around this idea of the climate crisis being a racial justice issue and of the solutions having to include social justice and to be anti-capitalist and for the recognition of the past abuses of colonialism. I do see a response from people, from civil societies, whether it is through the encampment of universities, of protests, of collaborations with influential people to obtain donation. The wind is starting to turn, and that the hypocrisy of Western government is starting to get noticeable. This is gaining traction as a way for people to connect and to have solidarity towards one another. And whilst it is coming due to tragic events, it gives me reasons for optimism. If I can say one thing, is that I'm fully aware that as racialized minorities or as marginalized individuals or communities, we've been targeted and scapegoated for many of the crises that are happening. And that has also contributed to people not wanting to vote or not wanting to get involved into politics. But at the same time, this is currently one of the ways in which we can enforce change and create change by voting for groups and advocating towards groups that defend values that can be of support to us and then that can contribute to a better society for us.
When looking at systemic failures, many different marginalized groups find themselves locked out of the conversation. In the green transition, disabled people are underrepresented and rarely considered, including when it comes to decision-making around climate. I spoke to Anna Landry, a disability justice activist and researcher based in the UK.
First of all, disabled people are some of the most negatively impacted by climate change and by the policies that we're making to try and deal with it, because we're marginalized in those policy spaces. And I think overwhelmingly, a lot of those working in environmental justice view disabled people as almost a threat. We require, for instance, more electricity to charge our wheelchairs, to power our ventilators. We need single-use plastics for our catheters and our straws. And I think because of this, disabled people are often pointed to as scapegoats for the climate crisis. But I really want to reframe that. Disabled people are part of the world like anyone else. We make up 15% of the global population. So this isn't a group that's a niche or it's a fringe issue. We're people that are here, we're here for the long term, and we must be included. And I think when you really get to the root of what both disability justice and environmental justice are trying to do, it's to bring people into these fights that have previously been marginalized. So environmental justice is looking at those who are most impacted by climate change, by the climate crisis, and that includes disabled people. Similarly, disability justice came as an answer to the disability rights movement, which similarly left a lot of people out, particularly disabled people who were queer, who were Black or brown, who were low income, who had intellectual or psychosocial disabilities. So at the root, these two movements should really be working together.
So when it comes to the green transition, is enough thought put into how it works for everyone rather than just focusing on the bigger picture?
The green transition, to me, is about making a shift towards economically sustainable growth, an economy that's not based on overconsumption. And when I think about disability in this, when I think about marginalized people in this, I come to two shortcomings we're having. Is that one, talking about a shift to the green transition is often not done in conversation with marginalized people. And I think you need to do more than just say, oh, this will be better for everyone. You need to actually consult those you're talking about, because we see disproportionate impact when we're talking about, for instance, climate change mitigation and adaptation policies, a lot of sustainability policies that are causing negative changes in the daily lives of disabled people. We see this in bans on single-use plastic and bans on cars, and it doesn't mean that these two things are incompatible, that justice for marginalized people and climate justice can't work together. It just means we have to be a bit more intentional, a bit more creative about how we approach them both. And then second, I think it's important to point out that conversations about a green transition are often still inherently phrased and framed as being tied to the idea that the economy must continue to grow infinitely and forever, and we have to be dedicated to that idea of production, even if it's in a green sense. And I want to draw attention to the fact that disabled people often don't fit into that picture, because a lot of disabled people can't produce in a traditional way, in a capitalist sense. Disabled people often maybe can't work full-time or work in a traditional way. And so while we all want a greener world, I think it's really important to ask hard questions about who that further marginalizes, about what inequalities and what negative patterns in our society it could reinforce if we're not really intentional about it.
So you study how disabled people can cooperate internationally on these types of struggles. What can happen when there's greater cooperation?
Historically, those of us in disability movements know that oftentimes the biggest gains come when we're able to unite, whenever we're able to produce coherent, unified demands. And that's across a community with a lot of really different and often competing needs. You're trying to bring together under one umbrella, under one label, people who are wheelchair users, who are blind, who are deaf, who are autistic, who have a chronic illness, who are schizophrenic. And this is really difficult, and yet when it happens, our movement historically has seen the greatest successes. So I think cooperation internationally is key, particularly because climate change is an issue that transcends borders, that affects disabled people wherever we live, in whatever country. And we're lucky to have a lot of fantastic activists, campaigners, researchers working now at the intersection of disability and environmental justice, climate justice.
You've worked internationally with governments and NGOs on this issue. What kind of response do you get, and what do you think should change in those spaces?
I think oftentimes the responses we get are falling into those tropes of, one, viewing disability as a really niche or fringe community, which we know that it's not. The UN calls this the world's largest minority. Or it falls into the trope of saying that disabled people are often those using up the most resources, whether it's electricity for our devices, whether it's plastic for our medical needs. And so we have to take a backseat and let other people lead. And I think those are both really harmful and unfortunate ways of looking at a community that can offer so much to this conversation. And I really wish that those formulating policy would look past simple ethical frameworks and calculations of utilitarianism and consequentialism. So for instance, just looking at what's good for everyone, or just looking at what gets the best result overall. Because although these are often the simplest ways to frame justice issues, they are known for stifling minority voices and propping up problematic concepts of the common good that in the long term create really big problems that come back to bite us as humanity in the end. And disability justice, in particular, in how it frames the human experience, has a lot to offer here. I often point people towards care ethics, for instance, which can be a helpful framework in encouraging policies that are inclusive of disabled people, of marginalized people in general, I would say. And it's really similar to the disability justice value of what we call community care, which has been written about at length by people like Mia Mingus and Leah Lakshmi Piepzna-Samarasinghe. And what care ethics does is it tells us that there is a moral significance in the fundamental elements of relationships and dependencies of human life. It really brings to light how we're all interdependent on one another, especially in a world that is more and more linked by media, more and more linked economically, and so on.
I'd love to ask you what is possible. If things worked in a different way, what could be achieved?
When thinking about what's possible and when thinking about the future, I think it's really critical to realize and become comfortable with the fact that disability will become part of all of our stories. Every single person will become disabled if we're lucky to live long enough. And besides that, we're always in relationship with disabled people, whether it's our grandmothers or our peers or other people that we know and we see. And so I think the potential of bringing environmental justice and climate justice together and in harmony with one another is becoming comfortable with this inevitability, with finding solutions, because disabled people are key to finding these solutions. We're often known as the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to new world events, when it comes to crisis, because we're the first to be impacted and thus the first to start finding solutions to what's to come. We're accustomed to working and living in spaces that are hostile to us, that are not built for us. And that resilience and creativity and community care is exactly the type of perspective that will bring us to these solutions that make a better world. The potential is being able to get there, to get to the best solutions, the most creative, the most outside of the box and inclusive and harmonic ways to come to terms with our changing world. Because climate change we're seeing is inevitable, whether we're able to mitigate it, whether we're able to adapt to it, we're going to have to do one or the other. And in the same way, disability is inevitable. Disabled people will always be a part of our societies, will be us at one time, whether or not we're disabled already. I really encourage people to read the book The Future is Disabled by Leah Lakshmi Piapsna Samarasenya, where they highlight this beautifully. There is no future without disability in it, without disabled people in it. And I think in realizing that and coming to terms and becoming comfortable with that, that is the only way that we're going to create a better, a greener, a more harmonic future for ourselves and for the planet.
Thank you to Matti Blindberg, Bejka Nilas, Eva Fjellheim, Magda Bulabiza, and Anna Landry. It is clear that we are facing a climate crisis, but it's just as clear that we cannot begin to solve it without racial and social justice. The crisis itself is fueling and creating new forms of inequality and injustice today. This means that we must follow the lead from those who have already been affected by and have been fighting against climate injustices for many years. Achieving climate justice is possible. We can repair the consequences of these wrongs in the present and shape a better future. We just need to be willing to put in the work to shift power into the hands of those who should be leading the change. This has been Whose Planet, the Climate Justice Podcast, a podcast from Systemic Justice, produced by Tortoise Media. The producer was Adrian Bradley. Find out more about systemic justice and our work at systemicjustice.ngo.